Saturday morning, we headed into the North Maine Woods, which is roughly 3.5 million acres of undeveloped land in northern Maine. There is hundreds and hundreds of miles of logging roads that are travelable by four-wheel drive vehicle. We headed out with full tanks of fuel and all of the ambitions in the world to make it 200 miles to Fort Kent that day. Little did we know, the Jeep would have other plans. We made it 45 miles into our North Maine Woods journey before the Jeep had a thermostat failure, which stopped us in our tracks. We drove for roughly 5 hours, taking Josh's Tacoma all the way back to Greenville and then eventually Dover-Foxcroft before we were able to find a new thermostat for the Jeep. We went back, changed it out in the field, and got back on the road again after losing 5 hours of valuable time in the North Maine Woods.
New thermostat is in. We were still having some issues with it not blowing hot air out of the vents, but that was not actually an issue. Purging the air out of the coolant system that we introduced with having that thermostat. We've been driving around now for about 10 minutes. Temperature looking good. We have blazing hot air coming out of the vents, which is fantastic news. We are going to continue the trip and see how it goes.
After losing 5 hours of time due to the thermostat failure on the Jeep, our goal of seeing the ghost trains and covering 200 miles to Fort Kent that day were not going to happen. Luckily, we were able to still hit the checkpoint to get into the North Maine Woods by 4 p.m. So we checked in and we selected a campsite that would be near the trains for the next day. We got into camp around 6 p.m. that night. We chose to stay at the Umbazookskus Lake campsite. It was roughly 30 minutes from the trains. The next morning, we would wake up fully rested with a renewed vigor to get this show on the road again. We left around 7:45 a.m. as we headed out and made our way to the trains, our first stop of the day. We got to the trailhead for the trains around 8:15 a.m. It is a short hike from the parking area to walk your way into these towering beasts that are the steam-powered locomotives that were put in place in the late 1920s. They hauled logs from the Eagle Lake to Umbazookskus Lake, 13 miles away. When the logging operation no longer needed them, it was too hard to try to remove the trains, so they just left them there, now in the middle of the woods with nothing else around them. After leaving the trains, we had roughly 100 miles to cover before getting to Fort Kent, which was our next stop for fuel. We had to make up time that we had lost the previous day due to the Jeep breaking down. We pushed hard and we were able to make it to Fort Kent by 1:30 in the afternoon. After fueling up both our vehicles and our bodies in Fort Kent, we would set off again for our next stop, which would be the Escort Station Airport, 60 miles away.
So we just left the Escort Airport, which is the most northern point that you can drive to in Maine. It's pretty crazy because it was a little over 30 miles from the town of Allagash, which is the closest town to it. And that 30 miles takes you roughly an hour on the dirt roads that it takes to get up there. Pretty wild. And it's just a random airstrip out in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Pretty cool.
After leaving the Escort Station Airport, we had no real deadlines or goals for that night, so we decided that we would just push on as long as we could, and when we got tired, we would find a campsite nearby and stay there for the night. In the North Maine Woods, there are over 200 campsites that are first come, first served. They are primitive camping, some having a privy at them that you can utilize, but most not. After driving for a couple of hours on the rough North Maine Woods roads, we decided to call it a night early, around 5:30 p.m. We wanted to get our tents set up before it got too dark and halfway enjoy the night. We decided on a place called Ross Lake Campsites. It's a beautiful little campsite right on a lake. There is a public boat launch there for you to put your boats into the water. When rolling into camp, there was a handful of camper trailers already set up there. North Maine Woods is a somewhat popular area, although there is enough room that most of the time you can easily spread out and not see anyone else while you're there. These campers did not bother us in the least. It was a nice, comfortable campsite. Before we had gotten to the North Maine Woods, we stopped at a local store, and they had a package of chicken breasts that was marinated in a house marinade. I also picked up some Knorr pasta sides. I could not tell you what the marinade was, but I will say this was one of the most delicious meals I've ever had camping. The next morning, we both woke up early and decided to get an early start on the day. We had a little over 100 miles of dirt left to go before we would arrive at Jackman, which would mark the end of our North Maine Woods trip. The last 100 miles of dirt would not disappoint, as we would come across some of the coolest bridges we had crossed during the entire trip. These bridges are almost entirely single car wide, and most of the time you come on them around a blind corner and they are also followed by another blind corner. This makes them extra dangerous while crossing, as you need to watch out for logging trucks and other people driving on the roads. The logging trucks will not move out of your way. They own the roads in the North Maine Woods, and it is your job to get out of their way. final day in the North Maine Woods would also be the day that we saw the most moose of the entire trip, seeing 4 in only a few hours' time. It is very important to let the moose get out of the road on their own terms. It is not safe to chase them or try to honk your horn at them, as they can either A, charge your vehicle and put you in harm's way, or they can try to run too fast and wind themselves and actually harm themselves by overexerting.